13 years ago, our company had grown to a point where we absolutely had to install a phone system. Individual phone lines just weren't going to cut it any longer. And so we sunk several $1,000s into a shiny new PBX, complete with voicemail. For our small office, that was a huge investment. But we soon came to realize that although that PBX was adequate, it was barely adequate. The system required proprietary phones. The user manual was almost impossible to understand, clearly written by folks who didn't have a good command of English. Setting up new extensions was challenging. And whenever it came time to make a change to that automated attendance script, well, that was just a plain nightmare. This PBX of ours was definitely a closed system. You had to play by its rules even if you didn't know what the rules were. And so we limped along for several years with that dismal system. But surely there had to be something better out there. Well, not long afterward, we started hearing words like VoIP and asterisk tossed around. And thanks to the authors of this book, I actually began to understand the concepts behind voice over IP and how we could configure a system that we could truly call our own, one that we could mold and shape according to our company's specific needs. For me, setting up that first asterisk server was nothing short of pure joy. And when the day came for us to shut off that old PBX and to start routing calls through our new server, well, it was like moving from the dark ages to the age of enlightenment. Now, making that switch to asterisk didn't happen because an overly zealous salesperson came knocking at our door. It happened because we needed something better. And we went out looking for a cost-effective, open-source solution. For us, asterisk met that need. And it continues to exceed our expectations with every new release. We saddled ourselves with that first PBX because we just didn't know that better solutions existed out there. And isn't that a good example of the saying, knowledge is power? 416 years ago, Sir Francis Bacon first made that statement in a famous essay that he wrote. But let's look at knowledge from a slightly different perspective. If people already saw the power in knowledge 400 years ago, how much more important is knowledge in this age of information? Where does business intelligence come from? Doesn't it come from data? And Asterisk offers us a number of powerful tools to work with and leverage data, not only in storing data into a database, but also in retrieving data from multiple sources. So this afternoon, I'd like to spend a few minutes sharing with you examples of how you can put your PBX on steroids. We'll start, first of all, by looking at a little website that we've developed, and then we'll pop open the hood and see how various pieces fit together. Asterisk makes it relatively easy to store call detail records into a database. And so our first objective was to start leveraging that information that Asterisk stores on every single call. I mean, this can be very valuable information. For example, our programmers are very skilled and knowledgeable at what they do, but they don't always have a very good grasp on the passage of time. For example, it's easy to pop from one support call to the next and meanwhile try to focus their attention on a project that they're working on and reach the end of the day and not have a clue how much time they spent in any particular area. And so having that CDR information available at our fingertips can really help us keep better track of how much time we've spent and how we can keep track of our billable hours. It also helps me, as an owner, keep track of which customers we've been working with on any given day. And it makes the job of returning missed calls a whole lot easier. A little bit more about that later. We wanted to make this information readily available to everybody on our staff. And so this first page provides a real-time list of incoming and outgoing phone traffic. It's a list that we can search and we can sort on the fly. And it really serves as the heart of our website. Now by default, the page brings up history for today's activity, but you can click on the calendar and select any other day, in the past of course, and then you'll see the activity immediately show up. You can also sort the records by clicking on any of the column headers. For example, if you want to see which calls actually took the longest over the course of a day, you can just click on the minutes header and sort in descending order, and there you have your list. And if we want to see how many times we talked to a specific individual or dialed a particular phone number, we can enter that information into the filter box at the top, and there we have our list quite quickly. Going beyond the CDR, we also wanted to create a speed dial list that we could integrate with this call history information. Speed dial is a useful function at any office. I mean, why would you dial 10 digits if you can get away with dialing 2 or 3? And so we can add a number to the speed dial list simply by clicking on the speed dial icon next to any of the numbers. Then we have to fill out a little dialog giving more details about that speed dial entry. But from this point forward, users simply need to dial star 12 or star 47 or whatever number is assigned and make things work a lot quickly. You can also launch the speed dial maintenance screen from the menu so that if you need to add or edit or change or delete records, you can do that from the menu. One of my goals at our company is to grow our company to the point where it's a viable organization even without me at the helm. But I can't do that if I and my programmers are constantly being bombarded by unsolicited phone calls from salespeople. And so we added a little blacklist to our system to help send future calls from the same number directly to voicemail. Here again, you can add a number to the blacklist simply by clicking on the icon. And then, like in speed dial, there's a little dialog where you need to fill out a little bit more information. And there's also a maintenance page, which can really come in handy to remove people from the blacklist in case a programmer didn't particularly like talking with a particular customer, for example. Well, let's talk a little bit about call forwarding. Have you ever planned to work from home, but then forgot to forward your phone? Now, with some systems, that can be a challenge. What do? You either have to call somebody at your office and ask them to forward your phone for you, or if nobody's there, you might need to drive to the office, forward your own phone, and then drive back home. But when you leverage the power of a database, that's not a problem any longer. For now, you can forward your calls from anywhere that you have web access. For example, my phone number at my desk, or my extension, is 101. So if I come to this dialog and simply enter the number that I want to forward my extension to, from this point forward, Asterisk will automatically route those calls to that new number. And finally, we get to my favorite feature of all. This took a little bit of time to figure out, but it was really worth every minute of it. So rather than having to dial numbers, wouldn't it be nice to just point and click? Let's say, for example, that you step away from your desk, but while you're gone, Mr. Smith calls. And now, if you know his speed dial number, of course, when you get back, you can dial it. But did you notice how all of the numbers on the next slide are all hyperlinked? So when you click a hyperlink, PHP displays a dialog which then allows you to, once you confirm, automatically connect to your extension and then dial out to that remote number automatically. So those are some of the benefits that you gain when you leverage and incorporate Asterisk with a database. I'd like to say that setting up this system was very simple, and in many respects it was. But in addition to having a working knowledge of Asterisk, and of course being pretty good friends with our buddy Linux, you also want to be familiar with a few other things as well, a few other systems. For example, you want to be familiar with how to set up a website and how to configure Apache configuration files. Also, it'd be good to be comfortable with how to set up databases and write SQL statements. And finally, it would be useful to have a general understanding of PHP as well. So it turns out that we have here an example of the LAMP stack in action: Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. But let me make a couple points in this regard. First of all, this example is meant to be descriptive, not prescriptive. These are the components that we chose to use at our office. But if you opt to use a different database or a different user interface, you certainly can. And that's one of the benefits of open source. You're not being forced into a framework that you're just not comfortable with. And secondly, although this setup is a little bit involved, it's really not rocket science. I don't have a programming degree, but I've kind of learned over time that if I stumble around a dark room long enough, eventually I can find the light switch. And so my point is that if I can figure this out, rest assured that you can as well. Once you get one component working, then you move on to the next one. And it's just a matter of wash, rinse, and repeat, and pretty soon you've got a system in place. And finally, don't feel like you have to do everything all at once. For example, when we first started working with our system, we didn't have PHP or Apache running. We were talking to MySQL using FoxPro over an ODBC connection. In fact, because we don't have a lot of time, let's not worry so much about PHP and Apache this afternoon. If you'd like a copy of some of the PHP code that we've written in this connection, I'd be happy to share it with you. Just see me after the session. For now, let's delve into how Asterisk interacts with the database. We want to cover, first of all, how to set up the configuration files. Then, we want to look at how to fetch data from the database. And finally, we want to look at an example of how to generate calls from the database without dialing a single digit. Now, as I move forward here, please realize that I'm not sharing carefully guarded secrets. Everything that I'm about to discuss is already covered in Asterisk, the definitive guide. In fact, it has a whole chapter devoted to this very topic, how to set up those configuration files and how to get Asterisk speaking with MySQL or other databases. But let's just go through a brief overview. In order for this to work, you need to set up several configuration files. Now, these files are designed to work together. But because of the huge number of ways that Asterisk can interact with data, these files are deliberately designed to introduce a layer of abstraction. So let's use a slightly far-fetched analogy to explain how these configuration files work together. Suppose you've been recruited and hired by the CIA, and your first mission, should you choose to accept it, is to deliver that envelope from your boss to a certain Mr. Smith. And then Mr. Smith will turn around and give you an envelope which you need to give back to your boss. Well, that's it. That's your first assignment. All you have to do now is just drive down to the airport and pick up your tickets at the imaginary airline's plane ticket counter. And you're excited to get started. And so you take the envelope from your boss and you start to head out the door. But wait a minute, you start thinking to yourself, I don't know if I have enough information. And so you turn to your boss and you ask, who is Mr. Smith exactly? Could I maybe get a photo so I know what he looks like? And is Mr. Smith an alias, or is that his real name? And where exactly are we supposed to meet, and when? And you know, I've never met this guy before. How can I be sure that when we do meet, I'm not dealing with an imposter? Maybe we should use a prearranged passphrase like, the corn is ripening in Iowa. And how can I be sure that Mr. Smith is going to give me the right information to bring back to you? And your boss turns to you and replies, don't worry about it. You'll get the answers to your questions when the time comes on a need-to-know basis. After all, we wouldn't want that information falling into the wrong hands, now would we? It has been said that every analogy limps, and maybe this one a little bit more than others. But let's see how it relates to the manner in which Asterisk communicates with the database using those configuration files. There are 3 configuration files that you need to set up in order to get Asterisk on speaking terms with MySQL. And all these files are really doing is helping Asterisk to figure out where to go, who to talk to, and what information to exchange. And the details are stored in separate files, made available sort of on a need-to-know basis. First of all, on the operating system side, we need to set up a data source. We need to specify the information that we want Asterisk to be concerned about. Are you familiar with setting up data sources, ODBC connections, in Windows from the control panel? If you are, then this is fairly familiar territory because that's exactly what ODBC.ini is doing for us. It's defining a connection to our database. Now, ODBC.ini could potentially contain multiple entries pointing users to different databases on different servers. And so our job is to define the connection that we want Asterisk to use. The three most important pieces of information are, first of all, we need to specify the database. In our case, from our analogy, that would be the who. Who are we going to be talking to? Then we need to specify where Asterisk can find that database. In our case, that would be the where. And also note that even though this is localhost, you can actually have a database running anywhere on any server in your network. And finally, we need to assign this configuration an alias. We need to give it a data source name. It's an alias that Asterisk can use to access the database. And so now we move over to the Asterisk side. Asterisk works directly with two configuration files. First of all, it needs to know which connection to use. And so it uses resodbc.conf here in order to make that determination and get a couple of pieces of additional information. Let's highlight a couple of those. First of all, the DSN identifies which connection in ODBC.ini we want to use. And then, even after we've got this connectivity working between the two systems, we actually need to authenticate into the database. And so we need to specify a username and a password. And finally, we need to give this connection itself a name, an alias, because just as there can be multiple connections inside of ODBC.ini, so also there can be multiple configurations inside of resodbc.conf, and we need to know which one we're supposed to use in the next step. And finally, we get to funcodbc.conf. Here's where Asterisk is grabbing the SQL statements that it needs to use in order to carry on that conversation with MySQL. Again, there's three pieces of information we need to be concerned about. First of all, the DSN entry identifies which connection inside of resodbc we want to make use of. Then we need to specify the SQL statements that we want to use. And finally, we need to give each one of these functions its own unique name because we're going to be referencing them from the next step from the dial plan from extensions.conf. Before we go farther, let me just make a couple of observations about these three configuration files. As long as we're here in funcodbc.conf, notice how basic these SQL statements are. And that, my friends, is by design. Now, funcodbc can be configured to write data out to the database. It can even have statements in it to retrieve data, multiple columns from multiple tables. But let's just not go there today. For our purposes, we want to get single, one-word answers, and we want to get them one at a time. For example, is the phone number of that inbound call on our blacklist? Or another example, what outbound number should Asterisk dial when it sees the user dial *12 in his or her phone? And secondly, let's also note that even though we're using MySQL in this example, you need to configure the same files whether you're working with Oracle, SQL Server, PostgreSQL, or what have you. Well, now that we have this connectivity set up, how do we make use of it? How does Asterisk use these configuration files to fetch data from the database? Let's walk through an example. If you want to use speed dial at our office, you need to dial * plus one or more digits. And as soon as our dial plan sees that star pattern, it routes all of those calls to the speed dial context inside of extensions.conf. Now, the first line doesn't do much. The no-op simply is providing some debug information. But the second line starts to get active. We are stripping off the initial asterisk, the initial star here, and we're storing the rest of the string that the user entered into a variable called speedDialPK here. And here is where all the magic is happening. We connect up with MySQL, we pass it the speed dial variable that the user entered, and then we receive back the number for Asterisk to actually dial. To do this, we call the speed dial function inside of funcodbc.conf. How does Asterisk know where to find that function? It knows because it sees this ODBC prefix in front of that function name. Now, there are other ways to handle this, but this is the default, and so let's stick with it for now. So the dial plan calls the speed dial function, and it passes in the number that we want to dial, the speed dial number. The function then queries the MySQL database and returns back the actual outbound number that we truly want to dial. And then it's simply a matter of finding an available channel and dialing that outbound number. So once you have your database and your configuration files all set up and tested, the process of actually fetching data from the database is really pretty straightforward. And finally, let's walk through an example of the patch me through logic, or how to initiate calls directly from the database. How many of you are familiar with Asterisk All Files and how they work? Well, even if you're not, it's no big deal. Basically, Asterisk All Files are just little text files that contain a set of instructions that Asterisk needs to carry out. So on our website, when users press the yes button here to confirm that yes, they do want to be patched through, we launch a little bit of PHP code. I don't know how easy that is to read. The comments are to read at the top, but the gist of that, what I'm saying there is this. Basically, Asterisk loves call files. It jumps on them as soon as it sees them, and I'll hopefully demonstrate that in a moment. But the problem can arise if we're still writing out that file and Asterisk sees it and tries to open it at the same time. There can be contention issues, and so we want to avoid that. And the way that we avoid that is by writing everything into a variable first, and then opening up a file and writing the contents of that variable out into the file and slamming the file closed as quickly as possible. So here's an example of what a call file looks like. As I said, it's just a simple text file with instructions for Asterisk to carry out. And let me call your attention to a couple of components in the file. The channel variable basically tells Asterisk who we want to call first. It contains the value that we would normally populate the dial command with. In our case, that's a local extension that we want Asterisk to dial first. Next, we're setting up a variable here called phone number. We could call it anything, foobar. But the point is that we need to set up a variable here that contains the outbound number that we actually want to dial. Next, we need to specify a context inside of extensions.conf that we want to use. And finally, we need to specify an extension inside the context. Now, understand, we're not going to be dialing this extension. We're simply using this as an entry point into our context. And this extension value is hard-coded to sort of an unusual value because we want it to stick out a little bit so that we can pick it up on the PHP side when we're displaying our call history. So what happens next? As soon as Asterisk sees that call file sitting out there, it opens the file, and it uses the instructions it finds in there to work its way through the dial plan. Notice how few lines of actual instructions are contained inside of this context. And this is the actual context from our dial plan. The blue lines are all just comments here. We don't need to worry about dialing our own extension because that's already contained in the call file. And so once we pick up our phone, all that's left for Asterisk to do is to find an available channel and to dial the outbound number. However, there is one additional step that we want to take. We want to store that outbound number into the CDR database. And so the SetCDR function here is saving the outbound number into a user field in the CDR table. Now you might be saying to yourself, why in the world would we need to do that? Well, that's a good question. Let's look at how this call, or how calls in general, are going to be stored in the CDR database when you're using the patch me through logic. Here's an example of how the corresponding patch me through records get stored in the call detail record database. Notice that that bogus extension number that we specified is getting stored in the destination column, and so it's really not doing us a whole lot of good. Also notice that if we didn't write that outbound phone number into the user field, we would have no record of what number got dialed. Now, when we display this information in the call history screen, we do need to play a little bit of musical chairs in the PHP code, but it's not real complicated. Now, no doubt you've noticed that so far I've been using hard code, or I've been using still screenshots. And there's a good reason for that. Because you never know when Murphy's Law is going to crash your party. But the last time that I checked, we had a fairly strong wireless signal. And if this is all working, let's try connecting directly into the website and actually making a call from the database. Let's look at this scenario, for example. Let's say that your phone is forwarded to someone else at your office while you're here at Astricon. But then during a break, you look at your call history and you notice that Mr. Smith finally returned your call, and you want to call him back right away. Unfortunately, your cell phone is dead. But you remembered to install a soft phone on your laptop before you came, and so all you have to do then is forward your extension temporarily from your office to your soft phone, and then make the call from the database. So let's give this a try. So the first thing that we normally would do would be to log into the application. And then we need to go into maintenance and into extensions, find your extension, and forward it to your soft phone. Now that that's been done, we have confirmation that the number will be forwarded and all calls will come straight to your soft phone. So then let's go into call history. And I'm going to sort in descending order, or in ascending order here. And let's go ahead and make that call. We get the confirmation dialog saying, are you sure you want to make this connection? And yes, we do. Notice how quickly Asterisk jumped on that call file that we created. So I'm going to answer the phone here. And with any luck, the call will come through here on my dumb phone. And there it is. So that's basically all that's involved there. So there you have a few examples of how you can put your PBX on steroids. Of course, there's a ton of additional features that we'd like to incorporate as time permits. One that comes to mind is giving users the ability to print off copies of the speed dial list or CDR reports for those users who don't mind sacrificing a tree for the greater good. Another would be to add one more hyperlink to the call history page so that our programmers have the ability to automatically push their information directly into our billing software. We already know the client, we know the programmer, and we know how much time has elapsed. And so then it's just a matter of letting them type a few sentences about what happened and push that information into the billing software. And finally, we want to start accessing voicemail over the web. Asterisk offers the capability of storing voicemails in the database, and I'm looking forward to incorporating this. Now, I realize that there's other systems out there that already have a lot of these features and more. So did we really need to reinvent the wheel? But one of my goals in undertaking this project was to find out what it takes to extend Asterisk's functionality to meet our company's specific needs, and maybe to have something to share with some of our customers as well. And frankly, doesn't everybody need to have a little bit of fun at work? For me, this is about as much fun as a programmer should be allowed to have on the job. And even though this is the end of my presentation, we've really only scratched the surface. At our office, we're not done enhancing and refining our Asterisk system. So if this last half hour has motivated any of you to build upon what you've developed so far, well then hopefully this time has been well spent. Any questions? Yes, sir.
If I'm observing correctly, it looks like when you connect a call, it initiates the call to my own extension, but then it waits until I answer before it initiates the call to the second extension.
Yes, it does. It waits for you to pick up your extension before it makes the call. And if you don't pick up your extension, there's a timeout, which I didn't go to every detail about the config files, but there's a timeout that once that expires, it'll try calling you again. So, yeah. Well, thanks for your attention.